Good afternoon, everyone. It's my absolute honor to welcome all of you to this momentous event, celebrating 50 years of the Center for Studies on Poverty and Social Citizenship, as well as 75 years of Carleton's School of Social Work. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to faculty, students, alumni, and community members who have joined us today, as well as those who have been part of this remarkable journey over the decades. This truly is a celebration of collective impact. Standing here in front of you, I can't help but feel a deep sense of pride, responsibility. This center was founded in 1974 as the Center for Social Welfare Studies. And it has not only been a cornerstone of research and education at Carleton University, but also a guiding light for our broader understanding of what is poverty, what is social citizenship. Just as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the School of Social Work, the Center's anniversary is also an important reminder of how structural social work has been established and continues to remain relevant in current social work debates and practices, both locally but also nationally. 50 years ago, a group of visionary faculty members, Brian Siegel, Len Ruttman, and Jim Albert came together to establish the center. Their goal was bold: to create a space dedicated to critically analyzing the systems and structures that perpetuate inequality. They laid the groundwork for what has become Canada's first social work department to adopt a structural approach, integrating critical perspectives into every aspect of teaching and research. But this wasn't just about academics. It was about action. It was about action of shifting the lens of social work from individual pathology to systemic analysis. So the center's early work on the social work evaluation included Leonard Ruttman's groundbreaking evaluation research methods, a basic guide. Some of you might have read that. Raise your hands if you have heard of it. Okay, great, awesome. And it was a testament to this vision. And of course, the center didn't stop there. It evolved to address pressing issues in housing, in welfare, social assistance, providing not just research, but also solutions that inform both policy and practice. In the early 1990s, the center obtained successive grants for the publication of the Canadian Review of Social Policy, which started at the University of Regina, was then housed at Carleton, and is now at York University. We owe a debt of gratitude to our founders and contributors throughout the years. And I'm going to list a couple of names, but they do deserve their names to be said. Alan Moskowitz, Alma Estebel, Andrew Jones, Ann Purvis, Arthur Stinson, Gary Miller, Helen Levine, Joe Hudson, Joseph Woolley, Peter Finley, Roland Lecomte, Roan Chaffron, Samuel James Albert, Therese Jennison, Thomas Cook, Aji Vandesan, Sarah Todd, Melissa Redman, and Zoe Felder. So there are many others who have shaped the center's legacy, and today their vision continues to inspire us. I would also like to acknowledge someone without whom the center would not have reached this milestone, Doug Bullock, whose generosity has not only funded critical research, but also has reaffirmed our mission to fight for a fairer, more just society. Doug's belief in this work reminds us the power of partnership in achieving social change. So on behalf of the center, I'd like to thank Doug for his unwavering allyship in this journey. As we reflect on the past, it's equally important to celebrate the present. Over the last decade, the center has continued to innovate, addressing the profound challenges of our time. From conducting participatory research with Somali youth in Ottawa to evaluating programs like Shepherds of Good Hope's Women and Gender Diverse Services, we've seen how research can translate into real-life impact. One of the most inspiring aspects of this work is its collaborative nature. So faculty, students, and community members come together not just as separate entities, but as equal partners in pursuit of social justice. So for example, our partnerships with organizations like the Somali Center for Family Services or Lanark County Mental Health highlights how community-based research can empower marginalized voices and shape policies that really reflect everyday needs. And yet, our structural approach remains at the heart of everything that we do. We continue to challenge the systems that create poverty, that create inequality, that create marginalization. remind ourselves and others that these are not personal failings, but societal ones, and they require systematic analysis and systematic solutions. So as we look towards the future, the question before us is clear. How do we build on the legacy that the center has made, that the school has made? How do we ensure that the center and the school remains a force of social justice in a world that's increasingly complex? I believe the answer lies in deepening our commitment to partnership and innovation. So moving forward, we envision the school and the center as a hub that not only supports faculty research, but mentors in the next generation of social workers, people who are sitting right here and sharing spaces. We mentor and advocate for activists who are inspired by structural social work. So the center is embracing the power of technology and new methodologies to expand our impact, whether it's through action research on racial discrimination during COVID or studies on health equity of racialized older adults. Our work will continue to lead the way in creating knowledge, not just for the future, but for a critical and transformative one. So on a personal note, I want to share why this work resonates with me. As the co-chair of the center, as a social worker, and as an educator, I've worked with families and communities navigating through different forms of poverty. Research, when done ethically and collaboratively, can be a powerful tool for change, and the center embodies this ethos. So it's a reminder that while the challenges that we face are immense, so too is the potential for collective action. In closing, as we celebrate the golden anniversary, I invite all of you to think about your role in this mission. Whether you're a student, whether you're a faculty member or community partner, your voice matters. Together we can build a world where poverty is not a persistent reality, but one that's a challenge that we have overcome. So let us honor our past, let us embrace the present, and commit to a future where social citizenship and justice are not ideals, but realities. Thank you. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Natalie Appleyard is the socioeconomic policy analyst for Citizens for Public Justice, an organization that is inspired by faith to act for justice. CPJ seeks to equip and mobilize communities and individuals across the country to advocate for just policies in the areas of poverty, refugee, and migrant rights, and ecological justice using an intersectional rights-based approaches. Natalie uses her background in education to convene, to share knowledge, and to build solidarity among a variety of communities and organizations. She's a co-convener of the We Go Together network, a member of the steering committee for Campaign 2000, and board member of the Canadian Health Coalition, and represents CPJ on the Canadian Council of Churches Commission on Justice and Peace. So please join me in warmly welcoming Natalie Appleyard, our keynote for today.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you today. It's really an honor. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Farrer and Dr. Redmond last year, I think, at a social work research fair, and have really enjoyed connecting with them, with other faculty at the School of Social Work, and with a number of students who have done placements at CPJ for their practica. So we love having students. You'll see on your tables there are a few sheets that talk a little bit about student placements at CPJ. So if that's of interest, I know I recognize some familiar faces from last week's agency fair. So nice to see some of you again. And again, I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to grandmother Irene for that beautiful opening. And I'm happy to give thanks to the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I grew up on Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory and lived there for most of my life. So it is a real privilege to be here today with you. I do have a background in education, and as a former teacher and the daughter of two teachers who are with us in the room today, I'm happy to thank my parents for coming, even though I'm over 40. It's great to have my mom and dad here. But one of the pedagogical practices that stuck with me the most is backwards design. So starting from the goals, the outputs that we want, the outcomes that we want, and then thinking through, well, how will we know if we've achieved those goals? How will we assess that? And then, what are the tools, what's the information, the skills that learners would need to get there? So I've set out some proposed learning goals for our time together today. And so here's what I hope that you leave today with. So I hope you leave today with a deeper understanding of the interplay among individual agency and historic and contemporary systems in people's experiences of poverty in Canada. I think probably most of you have a pretty solid grounding in that already, but we'll explore a little bit more about that today. I hope you leave here with a deeper commitment to engaging in social work as an agent of social change. And I hope that you leave here with a greater sense of belonging amongst social change movements for our mutual flourishing. So we'll go through a few of these throughout our time today. And to do this, I'll be taking you through some information, some data from our Poverty Trends Report. This is an annual research report that CPJ puts out typically every fall, where we look at the most recent available data on people's experiences of poverty in Canada. We look at historic and contemporary factors, policy recommendations, and opportunities to take action. I do apologize in advance that the text on the slides might be quite small for you to see numbers. So if you are able to scan the QR code on the slide or visit cpj.ca, you can find the report online. So if you'd like to follow and look up some of the, there's a map and a table that we'll be looking at. So if you'd like to have those in front of you, it will be a little bit easier. I'm not planning to read out the data too much and talk more about the trends. So if you'd like to pull up the report, you're welcome to. And I do have 5 copies for 5 lucky audience members. We're waiting for our printers to actually finish with the print job. So I just ran off 5 at the office. So I have them if you want to come chat with me afterwards, and I'd be happy to share, but more is coming. So when we talk about poverty in this report, and when we talk about it today, I'm referring to people whose inherent human right to an adequate standard of living is being denied them because they don't have the money to afford it. I'm going to be talking about poverty as a matter of justice and as a failure of policy, which is to say, a failure of Canadian society. But I'm also going to be talking about poverty as something that is not inevitable. I see ample evidence of resources, wisdom, and policy solutions that could eliminate chronic poverty in Canada for all people and all communities. But it will take a critical mass of public and political support to make that happen. And this is where I hope you'll see your unique role start to take shape within movements for social change, particularly as social workers. So there are several ways that we can estimate the number of people living in poverty in Canada. Our official poverty line, the Market Basket Measure, or MBM, is shown on this map, but again, I apologize, the numbers are really tiny. But the Market Basket Measure and the Low Income Measure, or LIM, are 2 income-based measures of poverty. So they look at what is a person or a household's income. The Market Basket Measure asks, do they have enough to afford this basket of goods and services? The Low Income Measure asks, do they have more than, there's the poverty threshold for the Low Income Measure, looks at the median income for a comparable household. If you have less than half of that median income, you're considered to be in low income. Okay, so we have 2 income-based measures of poverty. There are others, but those are the 2 we'll share today. And we can also look at other measures related to poverty like core housing need and food security. So you'll notice on the map, if you can see it or if you're following maybe on your mobile device, we have quite a range of estimates in terms of how many people are experiencing poverty based on these different measures. None of them are perfect measures. I'm going to say all of them are underestimates because of gaps in sampling, because of reasons why people choose not to self-report. Canada's official poverty line, when it was selected, did not include thresholds for the territories. It doesn't include people living on reserve, doesn't include people living in congregate living settings. So there are some pretty big gaps there. They have been making changes to develop thresholds for the territories, but I would just say, like, on principle, that seems like a pretty huge gap when you're choosing Canada's official poverty line. The low income measure in comparison uses tax filer data. So anyone who files their taxes, which again, there are gaps there in terms of who is most likely to file their taxes, and people in poverty are less likely to file their taxes than many. But it does mean that we do have data for the territories, we have data for people living on reserves, for people living in those congregate group settings. So again, neither of them are perfect, but you'll see, for example, that when we look at estimates for the number of people in Canada living in poverty, if we look at the market basket measure, the estimate is 9.9%. That is only for the provinces. So when you hear the Government of Canada talk about official poverty statistics, please just have in the back of your mind that that is just for the provinces. So 9.9% of the population is considered to be in low income or poverty, according to the market basket measure. If we look at the low income measure, that estimate jumps to 17%. And again, that does include territories and people living on reserve and other populations that are not included in the MBM. Still an underestimate, likely, because when we look at food security, for example, again, this data is just for the provinces based on the survey that was used. If you compare the market basket measure estimate for the provinces at 9.9%, if you look at food insecurity estimates, it's 22.9%. So what that tells us is that even people who are not considered to be living in poverty based on their income still can't afford the food that they need. So these are very different pictures of how many people are experiencing poverty and what that's like. If we look at core housing need, it's kind of in the middle. And that estimate right now for Canada is 11.6% in the provinces. So you can see there's quite a difference. Now, the difference in data is helpful when we're looking at accountability, when we're looking at evaluating the impact of different policy decisions. But I would say if you didn't care that 5 million people in poverty were poor, I don't think you'd care if 8 million people in poverty were poor. So the statistics are not to make the case that there is poverty and it's a problem. We know this. We know from people's lived experiences and the stories that have been shared for generations. You know, it's not that the data is telling us something that we didn't know before, but the data is really important for accountability and evaluation. Should it be chosen to be used in that way? And unfortunately, that's not always the case. You can also see in the report, I'm going to say in the report as opposed to on the slide, because you probably can't see on the slide, but there are quite different rates depending on the province or territory. And so we can draw some conclusions about the different policy landscapes, but also about the different demographics of the provinces and territories as well. So if poverty were just a matter of individuals falling on hard times or making poor choices, and if Canada was really a place where everyone had equal opportunities and access to their right to an adequate standard of living, we could expect to see pretty similar numbers for poverty across different characteristics of one's identity. But this is certainly not the case in Canada. So on the slide, you can see or in the report, you can find a few different points of disaggregated data by gender, by immigration status, by race, sexual orientation, Indigenous identity, disability. And I will just note that some of the language that is used here just reflects the way Statistics Canada or the surveys gather that data and define it. So some of the language is kind of dated, some of it's exclusive. So just that caveat. But, and again, these are from different data sources, which are collected at different times. So we can't always make direct comparisons across. So please consider these and the statistics on the map as more of a snapshot. So we can't always directly compare these numbers. But all that being said, it's pretty obvious that we're seeing some pretty atrocious, persistent trends in terms of who is most likely to experience poverty in Canada and what those experiences are going to be like, even in terms of the depth of poverty that they'll experience. So we can see also overlap among these different identities. So I'm sure most of you in the room are familiar with intersectionality and the idea that people's social locations overlap, and so the different systemic barriers that they face are compounded. People might experience privilege in one realm, but experience systemic oppression in others. So again, the statistics are just some snapshots, but again, through people's lived experience, we get a more fulsome picture of what folks are actually facing. So I've mentioned poverty as a violation of the right to an adequate standard of living. And I want to clarify that when I say that the government is responsible for this right to an adequate standard of living, that doesn't mean that the government is responsible to give everyone a home. The government is not responsible to give everybody food. The governments are responsible to create the conditions in which everyone can access their right to an adequate standard of living. And they are to use every policy lever in their arsenal to do so. And it's to be free of discrimination. So obviously this paints a pretty damning portrait of our track record in terms of the policies that we have in our society today. So the conditions don't exist now, but again, I want to reiterate that they could. So it's not inevitable. What we're seeing today is a result of policy choices. It's a result of prejudices and biases that have persisted in our society since colonization, since the transatlantic slave trade, and the various systems of oppression that are built into those views, including ableism and transphobia, homophobia. So we have this legacy of these policy influences and these perceptions that continue to pervade our society, but that doesn't mean we can't choose better. And we were reminded by Grandmother Irene's opening that better ways have already existed. So I know that studying poverty, studying systemic oppression is heavy, understandably, and on that point, if anyone does feel the need to, take time and step out, please feel free. This is heavy stuff, but it's not hopeless stuff. Again, there are better ways, and we have the tools and we have the resources for them. We just need to put our heads together and find that political and public will. I'm not going to actually spend too much time on this slide, but it's another example from a report of one of our partners, Campaign 2000, that looks specifically at child and family poverty. So this is a table where we can see, again, disproportionate rates for child poverty in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We see a huge gap in particular, even among First Nations children, whether they're on or off reserve. So many of you have probably heard that the government of Canada was found to be in violation of there was a human rights violation, I should say, that Canada was grossly underfunding First Nations children on reserve in terms of social services, education, healthcare. So we can see these huge discrepancies between our Indigenous population and non-Indigenous population in Canada. So I'm going to ask you to reflect a little bit on the impact of our current responses, our current situation on social work. I want you to think about who are your clients? What are they dealing with? What are they facing? How are you as a social worker expected to respond? And what are the impacts on our communities and on Canadian society as a whole? For your clients, again, we're seeing these disproportionate rates in terms of who's impacted by poverty and what that means for their lives, because poverty is both a result of various systems of oppression, but it's also, like class is itself another barrier that is compounded with other identities. Many people living in poverty are blamed for it. There's a lot of individualization of responsibility while not actually providing with people with the supports that they need to exercise meaningful agency. So there's a lot of burden of responsibility on people in poverty with very minimal supports. We still have sort of this charitable mindset when it comes to poverty, that it's, real magnanimous of us to provide social supports for people in poverty, as opposed to seeing it as a matter of justice and human rights and people in poverty as rights holders. We still have a lot of questions and conversations and debates, particularly in the political context, about who is deserving. And so these perceptions, these biases really pervade our responses to poverty. And it shows up in your work by the amount of paperwork you have to do. So I've heard stories of social workers who were like, I went into this field because I just love people and working with people. I want to support people. And instead I spend my time filling out forms to try to get people through, to jump through all these hoops so they can get this benefit, or they can be admitted to this program that they need, or they can get coverage for this accessibility device they need. Other folks found that instead of supporting and helping people, they were actually asked to take on more of a surveillance role, rummaging through people's apartments, looking for evidence that someone else might be living there to share the rent. That's not why people go into social work, right? So in the same way that you're dealing with the individualization of blame for the clients or the people that you're serving, there's also this experience that I suspect is common among social workers, that I found true as a teacher for a while, that you're also kind of expected to be a bit of a superhero, right? Like, you're expected to take on more and more responsibility with fewer resources. And you're expected to do it, in our case, it was for the children or for the students. So of course you're going to spend your own money on classroom resources because you care about kids. For social workers, anyone in a caring profession carries this burden of the people that they're serving, and particularly if you're coming into this role as someone who yourself has experienced poverty and these systems of oppression or this trauma. So we also see that, in the same way that certain groups are disproportionately represented in terms of who's experiencing poverty in Canada, we see some similar demographic disproportionality in terms of who's in care work, right? We see a lot of female identifying people, a lot of racialized people. We have a lot of migrants who come and do care work, right? And you're not always adequately compensated. You're not always adequately resourced. So again, it's kind of like the burden is being put on you as individuals, as opposed to the system saying, like, man, we better come together to make sure that we've got the conditions for everyone to thrive. In terms of the impacts on our community, we certainly saw the breakdown during the pandemic when you're dealing with a workforce that's experiencing burnout, that doesn't have paid sick leave, that isn't adequately resourced. So there were a lot of kind of crises that came up in the midst of another polycrisis where, folks had been raising these alarm bells for a long time, and then things kind of came to a head. And, I had really hoped that maybe that would be a tipping point, and I'm not necessarily seeing the follow through from, the pot banging about our heroes and frontline workers, or even, migrant workers who were provided permanent residency because their services were recognized as being essential. So we need to keep up this this pressure to recognize the importance of our care work and the care economy. So what would be different if we responded to poverty in a way that actually supported individuals and communities to exercise real agency? So if people had the resources to be able to act in a way that they knew would be meaningful, that they knew would meet their needs and their local context, rather than just individualizing that responsibility and shifting it to either the people in poverty or the people supporting folks in poverty. What could change for you as social workers if the people that you worked with, either as clients or as colleagues, actually had access to affordable, adequate housing, to food and clean water, to healthcare, prescriptions, childcare, education, cultural activities, decent work, right? Again, it's not even just about changing it for people who are experiencing poverty, but for people in care work and recognizing that there's significant overlap there, right? Like there's a lot of folks doing care work who themselves are experiencing poverty. And what if the people who were most impacted by these policy decisions actually had a meaningful role in designing them and monitoring and evaluating them? And what if our responses to poverty were grounded in evidence and people's lived realities instead of these misconceptions and political point scoring? So to figure out a better way forward, it's critical that we understand how we got to where we are today. So in the Poverty Trends Report, we take a look at just a few examples. It's certainly nowhere near an exhaustive list, but we look at some of the historical contexts in Canada, some contemporary factors, and how that shapes our current responses. So again, I'd encourage you to please check out the report in its fullness another time. But just as a few examples, I mentioned already, and Dr. Farrer already mentioned, too, that we're living with this legacy of colonialism and inherent racism, sexism, ableism that have shaped and continue to influence public perceptions, societal attitudes, and our policy landscape. We know that that's had a huge impact on people's wealth and well-being, their political representation and power, and how these have passed on from one generation to the next. So one of the best indicators right now of whether or not someone is going to be experiencing poverty is their parents' income. So generational transfer of wealth is a huge factor in the concentration of wealth that we have in Canada today. And of course, with that came political power and decision-making power as well. So one of the most influential historic contexts when it comes to poverty, well-being, would be land rights. So certainly we hear a lot about land back movements among First Nations and Inuit and Métis groups because that is so central to the ability to thrive and also economic wellness, right? So there were ownership laws that forbade people who were First Nations from owning land. If they wanted to own land, they would have to give up their First Nation status and couldn't live on reserve, which would separate them from those cultural connections and supports as well. I think most of us that example comes to mind pretty quickly in terms of colonialism and land rights. But I was surprised to know that it wasn't until 1987 that restrictive covenants in terms of leases or sale of property based on race, religion, country of origin actually were like not legally valid. So a lot of these had been kind of grandfathered into to properties so that they were restricting people based on religion or race and national identity, all these things. So those things are still around, and every now and then they kind of pop up. And without jumping ahead to contemporary factors, but these trends still continue. There are still many examples of discrimination when people are looking to sign a lease or buy property. So this legacy continues. We have a historic context in terms of our migration policies, who was allowed to come to Canada, how much did it cost them, what were they given when they arrived. So that, again, has impacted people's ability to create wealth, to own property, which was tied to voting rights. So there's all kinds of connections. And when it comes to voting, it wasn't until 1982 that all Canadian citizens had the right to vote. And it was even later for people in prison. And for a long time, voting rights were tied to land ownership. So again, if you couldn't own property, you couldn't vote. When we think about work, which is one of the most common responses when you think about poverty and what people say we should do about poverty, well, we should get people working. Most people want to work. And I'm not saying that work shouldn't be a pathway out of poverty. But when we think about who has been able to work and how people have been compensated for their work, again, we're seeing this historic context in terms of who has wealth and power today. So it was only in 1995 that women made up half of the labor force. So that's, pretty significant, not too far ago. I remember 1995. And it's important to note, too, that, again, when we're thinking about an intersectional approach and we're talking about women in the workforce, it was different for women if they were white and able-bodied and wealthy already, right? So a lot of white women's social mobility was dependent on Indigenous and racialized women's work as domestics and other underpaid labor. We have a history of social and political exclusion. We talked about voting rights already a little bit, but even something like recognizing sexual orientation as being protected by the Human Rights Act didn't happen until 1996. So those are, just a few historical contexts, just a few things that have set people up for what we are seeing today. And then if we think about some of our contemporary factors, we have this widening wealth inequality and concentration of wealth and power. You can also even just look at corporate concentration if you want to get into a whole other rabbit hole. Our labor conditions today are different from how they've been before. We have a lot of folks that are engaged in the gig economy, and many economists argue that that's because wages are not keeping pace with the cost of living. So we see more and more people who already are working, supplementing their income through the gig economy, or folks who aren't able to work a full-time job or regular hours, depending on the gig economy. We see persistent gaps in wage equity. We see a huge gap in terms of what many workers are paid compared to CEOs and executives. So this widening gap in terms of profit margins. And many folks still don't have access to things like paid sick leave or access to health benefits through their employers that other generations may have taken for granted. And then, we can't really talk about labor in Canada without mentioning, again, just the built-in exploitation of migrants again, that so much of our economy really depends on temporary foreign workers, on undocumented migrants, doing the work that keep our systems going. And for very little pay, for a lot of, and their rights are restricted because often their ability to be in Canada is tied to a particular employer. So it makes them particularly vulnerable to abuses from those employers. Another contemporary factor that I would point to is our justice system and incarceration. So we know that there is a huge connection between criminalization of poverty, our criminal justice system, incarceration. Folks who are poor are much more likely to engage with the criminal justice system, more likely to receive harsher sentences, more likely to experience surveillance and so then be charged or cited. If you look at the populations in our prisons, again, we see the same groups that are disproportionately impacted by poverty, overrepresented there. And we see, too, that anyone who has had that experience with the criminal justice system is much more likely to experience poverty, to lose their housing, to not be able to find work. So, again, it's this cycle here. So there's lots of other contemporary factors. Again, I know there's tons in the report that I'm not going to be able to cover today. But the last one that I'm going to point out is this shift towards privatization and deregulation, because this is happening across housing, healthcare, education, you name it, right? So it's this shift away from publicly funded, publicly delivered supports to private providers for profit. And what we're seeing is that these public systems have been so chronically underfunded that they're failing. So then the private sector is being propped up as kind of the savior that's going to come in and work their efficiency magic to save us all. But what our research is showing is that outcomes are poorer for people that were in privately owned long-term care homes, for example, or who go to privately run clinics, healthcare clinics, because the outcome that they exist to achieve is not community or individual wellness, it's profit. So this is a really concerning trend in our policy approaches today. So when we think about some of our current responses, again, we've talked about sort of a charity versus a rights-based mindset. I don't want this all to be doom and gloom because we do have tools and resources that we know work. So we know that cash transfers work. They don't work on their own. There's no one policy that's going to solve everything. But we know from basic income pilots, I think Kendall's going to be talking about that this afternoon, we know from CERB that when you give people a stable income that is sufficient to meet their housing needs, their food needs, other needs, that guess what? You lower the poverty rates. Canada had its lowest poverty rate during the pandemic, if you're looking at income, because of CERB. And now that pandemic benefits have ended, we have one of the worst poverty rates that we've had in a long time. Or I should say, not that it's the worst that we've had, but we just bounced way back down. So we know that if you give people financial stability, it's better for their health. We know that it does not affect their employment in terms of, it doesn't make people less likely to work, I should say. Many people maybe left an awful job and maybe got training, maybe became an entrepreneur. So it doesn't actually disincentivize work the way that many people are concerned it would. So similarly, we've seen examples with the Canada Child Benefit, with the Guaranteed Income Supplement for seniors, that these cash transfers work, but they need to be expanded. So right now, people with precarious immigration status can't get the child benefit. So even if their child was born in Canada, but they don't have permanent residency, they can't access the benefit. And there are other limitations there as well. We know that housing first models work. Housing first models with supports. Again, you provide people with that stability. You take away that mental stress, that physical stress. You provide people with that stability, and there are huge payoffs. There are huge savings when you have a housing first approach or a basic income approach to health spending, to the criminal justice system. So we have tools that we know work. We know that our tax system used to be much more progressive and used to be much more effective at redistributing wealth. So we've gone away from that, and we need to move back. So we have all these tools and levers that we can use, and we have evidence. Again, we have other countries, other people groups to whom we can look for these evidence-based examples of what would actually make a difference. And so when we think about how we're currently responding, unfortunately, a lot of our current responses are actually making things worse, right? They're re-traumatizing people. They are keeping people in poverty. So our current social assistance programs, for example, nowhere in this country does any social assistance program actually bring recipients up even to the poverty line, right? There's a huge gap between when, even if we say that we recognize that people require income support, again, well, we'll give you some, but we're not going to give you enough to actually get to the poverty threshold. Why? Because our society does not trust poor people with money. And we think it's too expensive because we're thinking that it's costing us as a society rather than recognizing the social benefits and the communal benefits that come from caring for one another and having healthy, thriving people and communities. So our current social assistance programs, while they don't provide people with enough income, they also don't allow people to find ways to save money, like rooming together, right? If they live with someone else, then their benefit gets cut, even though most people's social assistance isn't enough to cover rent. Or if it is, it maybe leaves, a small fraction of funds left over to pay for food and all the other expenses that life brings your way. So as much as people are concerned that basic income programs would disincentivize work, our social assistance programs actually prevent people from joining the workforce because they can't afford to work. Their social assistance benefits are clawed back so quickly and so severely once they start to earn any income and they also lose any access to health benefits that they would have gotten through their social assistance program. So if they try to start working, and maybe they're now incurring childcare costs, transportation costs, clothing, food, what have you, they literally can't afford to work. And that's a problem with social assistance, but it's also a problem, obviously, with labor conditions, right? So again, we have current responses that are just making things worse. And I would say our criminal justice system is certainly one of them, despite spending so much money. So we don't actually have evidence that our current criminal justice system actually deters people from criminal activity. What we know is that we see persistent patterns of recidivism. Whereas when we look at more rehabilitative, restorative practices, community-based approaches, they have a much higher success rate of reducing recidivism. And if you haven't already, I would check out what Finland is doing with their prison system, for example, where it's very much focused on rehabilitation because there's this understanding that, hey, these people are going to be rejoining society. We want them to be ready for that. We want them to be supported so that when they do reenter society, there's a path forward for them. So again, we know that there are better ways. We know that we have tools at our disposal. And so again, we have to come back to this backwards design idea and think about, what is it that we're actually aiming for? Because if you ask me, what are our current social assistance programs aiming for? I would say, I don't know, like administrative efficiency? No. They're aiming to fit within a certain budget envelope. And aiming to, help people a little bit, we think, right? But are we going to do it in a way that's informed by what those people tell us they need? Not currently. So again, what are we aiming for? How are we measuring whether we're getting there, right? So let's look again at the Canada Child Benefit, for example. We're aiming to reduce child poverty. We're not aiming to eliminate it, but we are aiming to reduce it, and we're going to measure that based on household income. So if your income, again, goes above that threshold, fantastic, we've done it. Okay, so we have to ask better questions about how we're thinking about our policies, how we're designing them, how we're evaluating them. And we have to ask ourselves who is benefiting. So again, we have programs that are working, but they're not working for everyone because they're still too exclusive, or they have too rigid eligibility criteria or administrative protocols. So for example, many of you may have heard about the new Canada Disability Benefit that is being proposed. Again, what did the legislation set out to do? To address poverty among people with disabilities. The budget allocation then shrank that ambition. And so now it's like, well, this is the money we were told we had to spend. So folks can get up to $200 a month. But if you have a disability tax credit, which we already know is really problematic because it's very expensive, ironically, and administratively difficult for people to get approval with a disability tax credit, because even the way they define disability is really restrictive compared to what the legislation itself used. So what happens is that people with disabilities will get a maximum of $2,400 a year, when we know that the gap is closer to like $8,000 for what their current assistance programs have and poverty thresholds. And that doesn't even factor in the additional costs of living for people with disabilities. So the folks with disabilities who are the most well off are going to be the best positioned to get this benefit. The folks who are in the greatest depth of poverty and who don't have the resources and the supports are going to be left out of this benefit, unfortunately. Or if they do get it, again, it's still going to be grossly inadequate. So, right, we started with a good idea, but it's falling apart in terms of the level of ambition that we have and the design, because we're not actually listening to people with disabilities when they say what's needed and how such a benefit should be designed and administered. That might change. Those are just draft regulations. There's still time, folks. Talk to your MPs, talk to your, maybe not now, but after the election. Ask your candidates, what they might do about this, for example. So again, we need to ask better questions about the way we're designing our policies. So we need a better vision. We need better measures. We have the tools, but we need to expand them. So we need to leverage the tools that we have. I've talked a lot about income transfers today. But, it's really not just about spending money on cash transfers. That's one example. But we also need the physical infrastructure. We need the labor conditions. We need the regulatory controls like rent control, like minimum wage, like making sure that there's a single payer public health care system and pharmacare system. We have these tools that we've got to leverage. So yes, it involves spending. It also involves how we generate the income that we need to fund those programs. So when we talk about our human rights obligations for governments are required to devote maximum available resources to ensure that these rights are upheld without discrimination. So again, there's the spending, there's the infrastructure, there's regulation, but there's also the way that they generate the revenue to do it. Okay, so that's the less exciting realm of tax policy in many cases, and other regulatory controls. It can be zoning, it can be any number of things, but the point is we have to use every lever available to us. So again, if we increased our ambition and if we got away from this scarcity mindset that, we don't have enough to do this, well, we do. We don't have to give $16 billion in fossil fuel subsidies. We could spend that money differently, right? There's lots of different choices we could make about how we're spending our money and, again, how we're generating that revenue. So when we're thinking about these policy levers and the creation of what we would call for a rights-based social safety net, we can think about our treaty and human rights obligations at the core. We can think about income supports, infrastructure and services, monitoring and accountability, and regulatory controls, all working together towards this common vision where individuals and communities are valued, they're supported, they can exercise agency, and our abundant resources and power are shared equitably and sustainably so that we live in balance with one another, but also with nature. We know we're not going to survive otherwise, right? We've seen what happens when this is out of balance, and we're living with that. So let's choose better. Let's not limit ourselves to how things have been for the past 100 so years. We can look further back, and we can look further ahead, and we can choose better policy choices. And I ask you to consider what social work might look like in this context instead. So what if, as social workers, you were able to connect people with the services that they needed and the supports they needed? What if your job was about connecting with people and providing care instead of surveillance? What if you felt supported as a worker and you were adequately compensated? We can think about focusing on rehabilitation and healing instead of recidivism and relapse. So I'm not saying that people are never going to experience a time when they don't have enough money, or that people will experience crises. And there are times where people just aren't going to have enough income, or might lose their housing, might have to flee housing. Okay? But our social safety net should be there so that that's not a chronic condition, and that doesn't lead to a spiral that traps people and then gets passed on through generations. So we should have systems that help people instead of harm them, and less time filling out paperwork. So when you're thinking about your role in this as a social worker, I really like these models that one developed. The climate action Venn diagram was developed by Dr. Anna Elizabeth Johnson. And so as you're thinking about, what role are you going to play in this enormously complex situation? We can't do it all, and none of us are called in quite the same way to engage with this. So she asks us to consider 3 questions. What needs to be done? What's the problem that we need to address? What are you good at? And what brings you joy? Because let's be honest, we all have those things that you're like, yeah, I could do that, but it would kill me. That was teaching for me. I could stay in this job. It would kill me. So think instead about, what is life-giving for you and what stirs that passion, so that even when it's hard, you know that you love the work. You know that you're feeling like, yeah, I'm using my unique social location, my unique gifts, my privilege in a way that is life-giving for me. And the other graphic that or model that I'm sharing is by Deepa Iyer from the Building Movement Project, which is based in the States. But she talks about these ecosystems of social change and all the different roles that are needed in those ecosystems. So my work does involve policy research and lobbying. It is not for everyone, right? It would be awful if it were for everyone, right? And for you as social workers, there's such a wide variety of ways that you are acting as social workers in our communities and in our society, right? So maybe some of you are there as frontline responders, and you are supporting people in a way that honors that inherent dignity and those inherent rights. And maybe as a frontline responder, you're sharing those stories, or you're advocating with your clients, with the people you're supporting, right? So just because you're a frontline responder and focusing maybe on people's acute or immediate needs doesn't mean you're not part of this social change ecosystem advocating for transformative change, right? And we're seeing more and more advocacy movements that are being led by folks with lived experience, that are being led by folks that have those direct relationships, as it should be, okay? Maybe you're a storyteller. Maybe you're really great at writing up articles or doing blogs or interviews with media where you're sharing these stories. Or I think of grandmother Irene sharing the story with us this morning, right? So storytellers are needed in these movements for change. We need disruptors. We need the people that are, having the encampments, that are having protests, that are standing up in the middle of board meetings or AGMs or what have you, right? Because as much as sometimes people might be like, oh, that seems a bit radical, like if we didn't have those voices, we wouldn't get that forward momentum that we need, right? So we need people at all points of the spectrum. So I would just invite you again, check out this resource by Deepa Iyer. And she has this great Instagram live series where she talks to someone who kind of embodies each role. So I found that fantastic because when I listened to the one about weavers, which is like making connections and synthesizing things, I was like, it's me. It felt really validating. So I encourage you to check it out and consider how you have been uniquely situated to play a role in social change, and to recognize that this will change throughout your life. This will change in different seasons, in different settings. So I'm talking to you as someone who does not have lived experience of poverty. So there are times where there are things that I can bring to this movement. There are places that I can step into that others might not be comfortable. But there are other places where it wouldn't be appropriate for me to take up, like a leadership role, for example. At CPJ, I don't come up with our own policy recommendations. They come from our partners. They come from folks with lived experience, okay? So just a reminder, you don't have to do it all to feel like you can do something really critical. So I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to talk with you today. I would love if you would connect with me afterwards. And if I could beg you to fill out a short survey, because I do believe in evaluation, I'd like to know, if there's been any shift in you based on our time together today. So thank you again, and I'm always happy to connect.
Thank you, Natalie. We do have some time for question and answer. And as Melissa, I'm going to ask you to take one of the mics and circulate. Maybe the first question to you, Natalie, is CPJ is accepting student placements.
Yes.
So we have 2 classes here benefiting from your analysis. Can you talk a little bit about that experience of student placement?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we love having students at CPJ. We're a small team. We're 6 staff. So when you come to work at CPJ, there's no gophering. There's you get right in there. Actually, this poverty trends report was co-authored by a social work student who did a placement with us, Ashley Thumb. And Sally also did a placement with us and helped with some of the research. So now they have publications in their name. So there's some neat opportunities like that. Again, our 3 main areas are poverty, climate justice, and refugee and migrant rights. So there's lots of different opportunities, whether you're interested in research and writing, if you're interested in government relations, in convening networks of advocacy partners or events, workshops. I've had students that delivered workshops as well. So you really get a good experience of what it's like to work in a small organization that engages in nonpartisan political advocacy and just the not-for-profit world as a small organization.
Any questions? We're going to circulate with the mics. Questions or comments for Natalie?
Hi, thank you very much. I'm David, an adjunct research professor at School of Social Work here at Carleton. A fantastic presentation, thank you. My question is, you mentioned as at CPJ you do political activism or advocacy. Could you maybe share some success stories and challenges too that you have encountered in advocating on poverty, climate justice, and refugee immigrant justice as well, and maybe some of the tactics that you have used to make political change happen? Thank you.
Okay, so one piece that I'll start with, first of all, is that our success always comes from the fact that we work in coalition. So I can't say that CPJ claims responsibility for any political change that we've achieved on our own. So it's always working in partnership. So some of the things that we have seen and celebrated would be just the fact that Canada has a national poverty strategy and just sort of the re-engagement of the federal government in poverty, in housing. So previously we had governments that said, nope, that's just a provincial jurisdiction. We've had a good 3 decades where the federal government wasn't investing in public housing or affordable housing at all. And so we've seen a re-engagement at the federal level. So we were part of a campaign called Dignity for All that was calling for a comprehensive rights-based national anti-poverty plan. And we got the poverty reduction strategy in 2017 or 2018. It certainly wasn't as strong as we would have liked. And so this is kind of one of the common challenges that we face in advocacy, is that we're really clear about what we want, and our vision tends to be much more ambitious than the resulting policy. But there are times where we see some steps in the right direction. So with the re-engagement of the federal government with the poverty reduction strategy, and then following that, the national housing strategy, which was stronger and which actually recognized housing as a human right in our domestic legislation. So before it was like an international human rights obligation, but that's harder to hold governments accountable to when it's not embedded in domestic legislation. So that was actually quite a significant win, because now what we've seen come of that are some different accountability measures. And again, we saw just a much greater investment in housing. We could have a long discussion about where those investments were made and how, and whether that's been truly effective compared to where the need is. But, at least it got it back into the conversation. So that's something I would say is a step forward. On refugee and migrant rights, CPJ and partners have long been involved in challenging the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States, which just means that if folks arrive first in the United States, they're not allowed to make their claim in Canada. They'd have to make their claim for asylum or refugee status in the United States. And Canada and the U.S. had that agreement because of the view that both of them were equally safe countries. We don't really think that's the case anymore. It hasn't been for a while, because even for something like people fleeing domestic violence or gender-based violence, that's not grounds for asylum in the States. So we've argued that this is a violation of human rights obligations as well. So we've seen, that court challenges that we've been involved in that have had, sometimes the win is that the public's talking about it. Sometimes the win is that people are learning more about it, and migrants are able to share their lived experiences with that. We did see the cancellation of contracts between provinces and CBSA in terms of immigration detainment. So that was a big win because it happened in every province. But unfortunately, then the federal government said, well, we're now going to take over those contracts with federal prisons. So again, you kind of win something and then it gets rolled back. So unfortunately, because of our political landscape, and one of the challenges of advocacy is that so much can shift with the political landscape and partisan, like I'll say more partisanship than politics in general. So even as parties are thinking about their platforms right now, and we're having conversations with them about what's going to be in their platforms, we're hearing, well, that might be good policy, but it's not good politics. So those are some of the things that we're up against. But again, where we have found success is when we can show that there is sufficient public support to push the political support to be there, or at least to assuage politicians that should they move on this, there will be the public support to keep them supported. So I think the climate marches would be like one of the best examples of that, right? Where all of a sudden every party had to have something to say about climate change. They had to have something to say about what they were going to do about climate change. That hadn't been the case before. So again, we saw this mass public outcry that demanded a political response. So it's possible, but it really, really, really needs the sustained advocacy. So as much as I absolutely encourage people to vote and ask great questions of candidates, really this is a long game thing. So you've got to stay engaged beyond the election. And elections, I almost feel like they're some of the worst times to engage in politics because there's so much spin and it is so hyper-partisan. But so yeah, keeping governments accountable beyond elections. Sorry, that was a really rambling response to your question.
Any other questions? Yep.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was really insightful, and thank you for your time. I know that CPJ does a lot of coalition work, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the We Go Together network and some of the kind of current coalition building that you're working on.
Yeah, I'd love to. So as a self-proclaimed weaver, one of my favorite things about this work are the many fabulous people that I get to work with and organizations I get to connect with. And also just the breadth of my portfolio. So my portfolio is anything to do with poverty in Canada at the federal level, which is why you get these really rambling responses to questions sometimes. But what I've found in my work, because it's covering a lot of different issue areas, is that we're facing the same challenges across those issues, right? So when I'm meeting with folks that are focused on housing or on healthcare, or even migration policy or labor practices, each of those groups is talking about privatization and deregulation and this kind of hostility towards human rights that's been increasing. We're talking about the impact of polarization and just some of the really awful rhetoric and scapegoating that's happening. So I feel that there are so many people that share a common vision who are facing the same challenges that we need to come together, because the idea of We Go Together is both that as people and communities across different social locations and social identities, that our well-being goes together, so that idea of kind of collective rights, but also thinking about the indivisibility of our human rights, that you can't say, well, okay, you can have your political and civil rights, but you're not going to get your social, cultural, or economic rights. Well, that doesn't work. It starts to fall apart when you try to divide them, just in the same way that things fall apart when you try to divide people and communities. So We Go Together is a group of organizations that are committed to building public and political support for rights-based approaches to public policy. So it's kind of intentionally vague and broad in that sense. And the idea is that people can come together for shared learning, to share best practices, to hear from folks with lived experience, about, so for example, we might have some groups that are working over here on housing policy, and then some folks from the disability justice community are coming in and making sure that there's a disability lens being applied there, or folks from migrant justice work and circles are coming in and making sure that that housing policy also brings a migrant rights perspective. So again, just trying to bring people together for shared learning, sharing best practices, and hopefully eventually sharing resources too, recognizing that there's a lot of inequity within the not-for-profit sector. So it's a fairly new network, and last October we had our first in-person symposium, so it's a work in progress, but I have a lot of hope that, again, we're just finding ways to reach our respective audiences with this idea that, our rights, our well-being go together.
Any other questions? Mom, Dad, how did Natalie do?
We're so proud of your little girl.
Okay, if there are no other questions, again, a round of applause to Natalie Appleyard. So we're going to conclude this part of our celebration. What's a celebration without cake? Cake is coming at 2:15. So we'll invite you to continue the conversation informally. There's some pop left and some pieces of bread, if you want to. Bread, lots of bread. So please feel free to, what do you call that? Network, if you will. And we begin the next part of our celebration with the emerging scholars at 2:30. So thank you again, and please enjoy each other's company.